Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Yes, so welcome to session 2 of the foremost Therīs of old. Today, as mentioned, we are talking about the list of foremost nuns, and I am going to share my screen and then we will dive right in. So you should be able to see the overview for today now. Today we're talking, as mentioned, about the list of foremost Therīs. So foremost Therīs means that a particular nun had a special quality in which she was very excellent. And so the Buddha mentioned her especially and assigned that particular quality to her. So for example, for Khema, we know that she was the foremost in wisdom, or for Upalavanna, we know that she was the foremost in psychic powers. And so there are many other nuns who were assigned those foremost qualities, and people compiled lists of those nuns. And the most famous list, I think the one that probably most people will be familiar with, is the one in the Aṅguttara Nikāya of the Pali tradition. And that list has 13 nuns on it. And that list has parallels in the Chinese traditions. And those parallels are extremely fascinating. The first one is in the Ekottara Āgama in Chinese translation. And that list has 51 nuns on it. So it's much, much longer than the Pali. And it includes many more nuns. And also the range of qualities that are included are vastly more diverse than the Pali one. So I think it gives a very beautiful overview over all the kinds of practices that nuns did in the early times. And actually, I came across that list only a few months ago. And when I found it, I was so inspired. I think that was actually the time when I got the idea to have this kind of course about the foremost Therīs of old, when I saw this list. And somebody else is coming in. And then there is a second parallel, which is called T126. It is also in Chinese. And that one isn't included in any of the Agamas or Nikayas. That one is an individual sutra preserved outside of the big collections. And that one has 15 nuns on the list. And so one could think it's quite similar to the Pali, because the Pali has 13, that one has 15. But actually, we will see they are very, very different, these two lists. So it will be very interesting to compare. And apart from these three lists, we also have apadāna literature. And when a Therī is assigned this a foremost quality, then usually in her apadāna story, she explains how she practiced and what kind of attainments she had, and then how the Buddha assigned that foremost quality to her. So in every apadāna story, usually if the nun has a foremost quality, it will be mentioned. But interestingly, we have a few apadāna stories where nuns are assigned foremost qualities, and those nuns and those qualities aren't actually found on any of the lists that we have. So outside of this list, we still have a few more nuns that we only know from the apadāna literature that they have those foremost qualities. So today we're going to look at the Avadana Sataka, which is a Sanskrit apadāna text, and the Kama Sataka, which is a text that is only preserved in Tibetan. And we'll encounter a few more nuns, 5 more nuns there that are not found on any list. And then we know that Buddhists throughout the millennia have liked to compile lists about foremost monks and nuns and lay people. So we also have somewhat more modern lists. And when I say more modern, that doesn't mean that they're from modern times. They're still probably quite ancient, but they are newer than the commentarial tradition. So we know the famous Pali commentaries were written roughly 1,000 years after the Buddha. So those lists are more modern than the commentaries, but still not like very modern. So one list that I recently was introduced to is from the Khmer tradition in Cambodia. And it was Ayatata and Dr. Uch who showed me that list. And that's a very fascinating list because it's closely related to the Pali tradition. I mean, it's obviously based on the Pali tradition, and it has 50 nuns. So it's vastly longer than the list we have in the Aṅguttara Nikāya. And it includes nuns from all the various historical strata of text. So it includes nuns from the Aṅguttara Nikāya list and from the Therīgāthā, but also from the Vinaya and from apadānas and from commentaries. So it's a very fascinating mixture of nuns that we find there. So if there's time, we will also have a brief look at that list. And the first one we are going to have a look at today is the Aṅguttara Nikāya list, the well-known list. This is Bhante Sujata's translation, and it begins as follows. So the foremost of my nun disciples in seniority is Mahapajapati Gautami. Before I go through the entire list, I should mention that the next 10 sessions of our course, we will focus on specific nuns. So each session has one specific nun, and those, because we have special sessions for all those nuns, I'm not going to talk about them today. I'm going to skip over them and only talk about the nuns that will not reappear anymore in our course. So next week will be about Mahapajapati Gautami, so I'm not going to say much about her today. So I hope you won't be disappointed and you just be patient and wait until next week. So Mahapajapati Gautami is always the first one on any list that I have seen, because she is supposedly the founder of the bhikkhunīs sangha. There's a very famous story about how she asked the Buddha to found the bhikkhunīs sangha. Whether or not that is historically accurate is something that we will explore next week. But definitely that is what the tradition says, and that's why she is in the first place in all of the lists. And then she's followed by Khema and Upalavanna with their two qualities, wisdom and psychic powers. And of course, Khema and Upalavanna are the two female chief disciples of the Buddha. So they are the female counterparts to Sariputta and Mahamoggallana. So when people say the Buddha had two chief disciples, that's actually incorrect. The Buddha had 4 chief disciples, 2 male and 2 female. So Sariputta, Mahamoggallana, Khema, and Upalavanna. But we have separate courses, separate sessions on them. So we're going to skip over them. And then the one who have memorized the text on monastic training is Patachara. So Patachara is the foremost in Vinaya. We also have a session on her. And then those who speak on the teaching is Dhammadinna. So Dhammadinna, of course, is very famous because we have one of her suttas preserved. She is one of the very few nuns whose teachings have been preserved by the tradition. And her sutra is the Chula Vedala Sutta, Majjhima Nikāya 44. And it is still a highly valued teaching and very often taught until today. And so Dhammadinna is one of the examples that we can cite when people say, oh, the early nuns were uneducated and they weren't able to teach. And that's why we don't have any teachings preserved of the early nuns. It's because they didn't give any teaching. But actually, when we look deeper, there are so many nuns who gave teachings. In the Pali tradition, we have Dhammadinna, we have Kajangala, we have Sukha, we have Khema, we have so many others. And when we look at the Chinese list in a few minutes, we will see there's so many other nuns also teaching. So that's a myth that is very clearly debunked. And the next one of those who practice absorption, that is jhana, is Nanda. So Nanda is the Buddha's half-sister. She, actually, according to her commentarial story and to her apadāna story, she didn't want to go forth at first. She only went forth because her entire family went forth, Mahapajapati and her brother Nanda, and Rahula and many others. And because she wanted to be with her family, she went forth. So she actually went forth to have a family life. But of course, the Buddha then taught her the Dhamma, and she eventually attained arahantship, and she also attained this foremost quality in jhana practice. And Nanda is a very interesting character because she's often kind of mixed up with her brother Nanda's fiance. So her brother Nanda, the Buddha's half-brother Nanda, male Nanda, he was actually engaged to be married. And on the day of his marriage, of his wedding, the Buddha snatched him away and ordained him. And his fiance is called Janapada Kalyani. And interestingly, Nanda's kind of nickname in the apadāna stories is also Janapada Kalyani. And it's very clear that in some of the texts, she and that other woman, the fiance, are kind of mixed up and they're not properly kept separate. So there's also something very interesting going on here with this Nanda and her brother Nanda's fiance. But we're not having a session on her, so we're not going to explore that in more detail in this course. And the next nun, foremost of those who are energetic, is Sona. And Sona is very special because she is conceptualized very differently in the Pali tradition and in the Chinese tradition. So in the Pali tradition, she has this backstory where she's elderly. She had 10 children, and the children asked her to pass on the inheritance, which she did. And of course, the children promised her to look after her and to provide everything for her. But when they got the money, all the 10 children kicked her out of their houses and she had no place to go. And so she went to the monastery and got ordained. And all the other nuns kind of looked down on her because they knew that she wasn't there for the proper reasons. Like she didn't have a spiritual vocation. She only needed a place to stay and some food. And so after a while, Sona felt really bad because she also thought that she actually should practice the Dhamma. And so she made a huge effort and got fully enlightened. And that's why she got this quality assigned for being very energetic. And in the Chinese tradition, her character is very different. And we are going to see that when we come to the Chinese list. And the next one, the one with clairvoyance, is Sakula. So she has the third eye or the divine eye. And she can see devas and can see things that happen far away. And the next one, the one with swift insight, is Bhaddakundalakesa. Bhaddakundalakesa is an extremely interesting nun, and we are going to have a session on her. And then next one is those who recollect past lives, is Bhattakapilani. And Bhattakapilani, we're also having a session on her. She is Mahakassapa's wife or ex-wife. And as we have seen last time, Mahakassapa is portrayed by the tradition to have been extremely misogynistic, very much against bhikkhunīs, very much against the female sangha. But he has a wife who is actually a bhikkhunī. So that's a very interesting constellation. And also Bhattakapilani is portrayed very differently in various Chinese texts as compared to the Pali. So that is something that will be a very interesting session to explore Bhattakapilani. And then foremost of those who have attained great insight is Bhattakachana. And Bhattakachana is interesting because her name does not reappear anywhere else in the early strata of the Pali text. And she is associated often or usually by the tradition with Yasodhara, Rahula Mata, so the Buddha's ex-wife. And Yasodhara, Rahula Mata also is never mentioned at all in the early texts of Buddhism. She only appears in later literature. And also compared, the Pali tradition compared to the Chinese traditions, we see that she's also her character is also fairly different. So she is really not a very well-defined personality. And we are going to have a session on Yasodhara where we're going to explore this in a lot more detail. Oops. And foremost of those who wear coarse robes is Kisa Gotami. Kisa Gotami also has a very dramatic life story, and she's practicing an ascetic practice here, wearing coarse robes, and this is the only ascetic practice that is mentioned in the Pali list. But we're having a session on the nuns who are practicing ascetic practices, so then we're talking about Kisa Gotami more. And then those who are strong in faith is Singalaka Mata. That is the mother of Singalaka, and Singalaka is a fairly famous person in the Theravada tradition because there is a long sutta in the Aṅguttara Nikāya called the Sigalaka Sutta or Sigalovada Sutta, which is Aṅguttara Nikāya 31. And it's often called the householder Vinaya because there the Buddha gives a very long, very detailed discourse to Sigalaka how to have a successful and happy and prosperous and virtuous life as a householder with a lot of detail. And that's why the Sigalaka Sutta is famous. And so Sigalaka Mata is the mother of this Sigalaka. And that was the Pali list. And we are moving on to the Chinese. This is Bhante Analu's translation from the Ekottara Āgama. So among my ordained disciples, the foremost of those nuns who have gone forth to train for a long time and are thus respected by the king of the country is the nun called Mahapajapati Gotami. So again, we see Mahapajapati in the first place, the first mention, followed by Kema and Upalavana for their respective qualities, wisdom and supernormal powers. And then we see number 4 is of those who undertake ascetic practices, the 11 restraints is the nun called Kisa Gotami. So we just now in the Pali, we saw Kisa Gotami as the foremost of those who wear coarse robes. So in the Pali, she is doing one ascetic practice. Here in the Chinese, she is doing all of them. And the Chinese mentions 11 restraints. So it seems that they had, at that point in time, they had 11 ascetic practices. In the Pali later tradition, we have 13 ascetic practices. And in the early texts, we don't have a clear number. It's just a cluster of ascetic practices, but they're not yet elaborated and defined to the same degree as they then were later on in the later tradition. So we are going to explore more about ascetic practices in one of our sessions. So I'm moving on. Of those possessing the divine eye, having supremely unobstructed vision is the nun called Sakula. So that's exactly the same as in the Pali. And Sakula has a small part of a discourse in the Ekottara Āgama, where she displays this quality of having the divine eye, and the Buddha actually praises her in front of the monks and says that he doesn't have any other disciple who is as capable or as skilled in the divine eye as Sakula. So the Buddha actually places her even above the monks who have the divine eye. So that's kind of special. The foremost of those who sitting in meditation enter concentration with a mind that is not scattered is the nun called Sama. Sama has a verse in the Therīgāthā, but when we compare to the Pali list, we would have expected the Buddha's half-sister Nanda to be in this place, because in the Pali, Nanda is the one with the deep concentration attainments. But as I mentioned, Nanda is kind of like a confused character in the tradition. She is not very clearly defined, and it seems that in the Chinese she wasn't very prominent at all, because she doesn't appear at all in this list of 51 nuns. So Nanda just simply isn't found here. And of those who analyze the meaning and widely teach the development of the path is the nun called Padmaranjana. So Padmaranjana does not appear in the Pali tradition, and of course she has a teaching quality here. So she's one of the teaching nuns. Of those who respectfully uphold the disciplinary rules without infraction is the nun called Patachara. So we see Patachara again with her Vinaya quality. Here her quality is slightly different from the Pali. In the Pali, she was one who had memorized the Vinaya. Here she is one who keeps the rules. So there's a slightly different angle, but in both traditions, she is associated with Vinaya practice. And then of those who have irreversibly attained liberation by faith is the nun called Bhaddakachana. So we see Bhaddakachana again, the one who is associated with Yasodhara. But again, her quality is different from the Pali. In the Pali, she had a wisdom quality. Here she has a faith quality. So she seems to have had a different character in the Chinese tradition. And of those who have attained the 4 analytical knowledges, being without timidity in the heart is the nun called Vijaya. Vijaya reappears regularly, both in the Pali and in the Chinese. She has verses in the Therīgāthā. She also appears in the Bhikkhunīs Samyutta and the Chinese parallels to the Bhikkhunīs Samyutta. And the Pali commentaries explain that she was a friend and a student of Khema. And Khema obviously is the one foremost in wisdom. So it's kind of to be expected that her students also have wisdom qualities. And the 4 analytical knowledges means that this also is a wisdom quality. So that matches quite well. The Chinese text here matches quite well with the Pali commentarial tradition. Okay, so among my ordained disciples, the foremost of those nuns who recollect their own past lives for innumerable eons is the nun called Vattakapilani, Mahakasapa's wife. So this is the same as in the Pali. Of those who are of upright countenance and thus respected and liked by the people is the nun called Himajata. Himajata does not appear in the Pali, and also this quality isn't mentioned anywhere in the Pali. Of those who overcome heterodox practitioners and establish them in the right teaching is the nun called Sona. So here we have Sona again. And Sona is the one who in Pali had the 10 children, was kicked out of the house, and then was the one foremost in energy because she made such a huge effort at her very old age to attain arahantship. In the Chinese, as I mentioned, her character is different. She has a sutta preserved in the Ekottara Āgama, where she debates with the 6 famous teachers of non-Buddhist religious movements. So during the Buddha's time, of course, there were many wandering movements, many samana movements, and the teachers of those movements were challenged by Sona to a debate, and Sona overcame them all according to that discourse. And then the Buddha praises her, and again he says that apart from himself, no one else except for Sona could have done that. So again, he places her even ahead of the monks in this ability to debate and overcome heterodox practitioners. So clearly this quality here is alluding to that discourse in the Ekottara Āgama. So the next one is again Dhammadinna. Of those who analyze the meaning and widely discourse on divisions and parts of the Dharma is the nun called Dhammadinna. So she again has her Dhamma teaching quality. And of those who are not ashamed of wearing rough robes is the nun called Uttara. So Uttara here is has the same quality that Kisa Gotami has in the Pali, but because Kisa Gotami in the Chinese text is already assigned to keeping all of the ascetic practices, as we have seen before, the ascetic practice of specifically only just wearing rough robes is assigned to another nun called Uttara, and Uttara also has verses in the Therīgāthā of the Pali tradition. So of those who have calm senses and are always with a unified mind is the nun called Pabba. So this is a samadhi quality, and Pabba doesn't appear in the Pali tradition. Of those who wear the robes in an orderly manner, always according to the instructions of the Dharma, is the nun called Jenti. Jenti has a verse in the Therīgāthā. Of those who are able to discuss in various ways without doubt or hesitation is the nun called Dantika. Dantika is also mentioned in the Therīgāthā. She has verses there. And again, she has a teaching quality here. Of those who compose stanzas in praise of the virtues of the Tathagata is the nun called Devadina. So Devadina does not appear in the Pali, but this quality, composing stanzas in praise of the virtues of the Tathagata, so composing stanzas, is a quality that is recognized in the Pali. There is a monk called Vangisa who has the same quality associated, and generally throughout many of the early texts, also other Chinese texts that belong to different traditions, this quality of being able to compose stanzas, it seems to have been very, very highly valued. And probably that is because the early tradition was an oral tradition and an oral culture. So language wasn't really written down. And the ability to play with language and to make it beautiful and to spontaneously be able to be creative with language seems to have been very greatly valued throughout all the different Buddhist traditions, probably because of that oral culture. And of those who are widely learned and in their kindness reach out even to the most inferior is the nun called Gopi. Among my ordained disciples, the foremost of those nuns who are always in secluded, quiet places instead of living among people is the nun called Abhaya. So Abhaya has verses in the Therīgāthā, and we see that she has a kind of ascetic practice attached to her, being always in a secluded, quiet place. Which of course is interesting because according to the Vinaya, as we have it nowadays, this would be a practice that would be highly difficult or actually not really permitted by the Vinaya. So that is a very interesting tension that we see here between the texts, and something we're going to explore in the session about the ascetic practices. Of those who beg for alms, even when physically ill, without choosing between rich and poor donors, is the nun called Visakha. Visakha also has a verse in the Therīgāthā, and again, this is a kind of ascetic practice. Of those who sit alone in a single place without moving at all is the nun called Bhattapala, again, a kind of ascetic practice. Of those who wander everywhere, begging for alms among a range of people is the nun called Manohari. So again, some kind of ascetic practice. Of those who quickly accomplish the fruits of the path without in the course of that encountering any obstruction is the nun called Dhamma. So her quality is very, very similar to the one of Bhattakundalakesa. Of those who keep to the three main robes, never being separate from them, is the nun called Sudama. So this again is an ascetic practice. Of those who always sit at the root of a tree with an unmoving mind is the nun called Lina, an ascetic practice. Of those who always live out in the open without caring for cover is the nun called Shatua, yet another ascetic practice. And here we see that this name is obviously a Chinese name. So it is sometimes very difficult to reconstruct the Indian or Indic name from the Chinese characters. And sometimes we can say with high certainty what the name is. Sometimes we have to guess, and sometimes we just have no idea at all. And in this case, obviously Bhante Analayo felt everything was too uncertain, and he just left the Chinese name here. And we're going to see that later again with another nun. Of those who delight in empty and secluded places, not in being among people, is the nun called Upachala. Again, an ascetic practice. And Upachala is Sariputta's sister. She is well attested in the traditions. Sariputta had 6 siblings, 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and all of them attained arahantship. And Upachala has verses in the Therīgāthā, and she's also mentioned in the Bhikkhunīs Samyutta and the Chinese parallels to the Bhikkhunīs Samyutta. So she does reappear regularly in other texts. Of those who continually sit on a grass mat without even putting a cloth on it is the nun called Vinna. So this is another ascetic practice. And of those who wear rag robes and go to beg for alms from houses in the proper order is the nun called Anupama. So another ascetic practice. And Anupama is found in the Pali. She has long verses in the Therīgāthā. She comes from a very rich household. Her father was a treasurer. And yeah, it's very interesting, the contrast from the very rich household then to going to do these very austere ascetic practices. And for me, these kind of small discoveries are so beautiful, because from the Pali we get one aspect of her character, and then when we look at the Chinese, it's like another puzzle piece that comes in, and we get a more complete picture of that nun. So if things fit together very nicely, I always think that is really beautiful. And that's why I also like so much to explore the different Buddhist traditions, because we just learn so much more about the lives of the early Therīs. And so Anupama is one of the examples that I found very beautiful. Among my ordained disciples, the foremost of those nuns who delight in staying in abandoned cemeteries is the nun called Uttama. So another ascetic practice. And Uttama also has verses in the Therīgāthā. Of those who dwell much in metta, thinking of all forms of life with empathy, is the nun called Chanda. Chanda also has a verse in the Therīgāthā. And here we see something we haven't seen before, a Brahma Vihara practice, namely loving kindness, metta practice. Followed by the compassion practice, another Brahma Vihara practice. Of those who have compassion for living beings who have not yet reached the path is the nun called Soma. And Soma, again, is a nun that is portrayed very differently in the different traditions. She will reappear again in the other lists that we will discuss later. In the Pali tradition, she appears in the Therīgāthā and also in the Bhikkhunīs Samyutta, and then also in the Chinese parallels. And she is the nun who is challenged by Mara, and Mara says to her, well, why do you practice at all? You're a woman, you don't have the wisdom, women can't attain, so it's a complete waste of time for you to be practicing. And of course, Soma refutes him and tells him that only people under the sway of Mara think in this way and think in these gender stereotypical ways. And one who has actually seen the path and who has attained awakening knows that gender is entirely irrelevant. So she is one of those persons, or this is one of the texts where we can very clearly see the attitude of the early texts towards men and women and gender questions, and it's just entirely irrelevant when you practice the path. So that is Soma in the Pali tradition. So in the Pali tradition, she is not mentioned on the list of foremost nuns, but she's very clearly present and very popular. And here she does a compassion practice. Yeah, it doesn't connect really with the Pali, but of course it's possible that she does compassion practice and also talks to Mara, so it's not contradictory either, but it's also not very similar. Of those who delight in the attainment of the path with the aspiration to reach it wholly is the nun called Matali. So she seems to be someone who is still on the path, who hasn't reached arahantship yet. Of those who are restrained in all activities and whose mind does not stray far away is the nun called Kalaka. So she seems to be doing some mindfulness in daily life practice. Of those who keep to emptiness and hold on to vacuity, understanding that there is nothing substantial in the world, is the nun called Devasutta. So she is doing a kind of samadhi practice that is called Sunyata Samadhi. Of those whose heart delights in signlessness and in discarding all attachments is the nun called Suryapabba. So she's doing Animita Samadhi, which is also a very profound samadhi practice. Of those who cultivate wishlessness with their mind always willing to help others widely is the nun called Manapa. Of those who are free from doubt in regard to all teachings and who deliver people without limits is the nun called Vimada. Of those who are able to explain widely and analyze the meaning of profound teachings is the nun called Samantapabbasa. So these last two are again teaching nuns. They don't appear in the Pali. So among my ordained disciples, the foremost of those nuns who cherish patience in the heart, being just like the earth, which tolerates anything, is the nun called Dhammadi. So this nun is doing a 4 elements practice, specifically earth element practice. And she's also practicing Khanti, patience. So these are also practices we haven't seen so far. Of those who are able to teach and transform people, inducing them to make gifts to the monastic community of utensils, beds, and seats, is the nun called Suyama. So this is an interesting point because in the Chinese original text, Suyama is actually assigned 2 different qualities. And Bhante Analayo then chooses to put those 2 together into 1 quality because he thinks, or he left a note there, says it really doesn't make much sense to him, the way the text is written in Chinese. But actually, I think it's, I had a look at the text and I think it's, it does make a lot of sense to keep it separate. Sorry. And I'm having a very dry mouth today. Sorry about all the coughing. So in the Pali tradition, for the monks, we see that very regularly, that a monk is assigned several different qualities. For example, Ananda is assigned 5 different qualities, and other monks are assigned like 2 or 3 different qualities. So it's not at all unusual that a nun would be assigned 2 qualities. And I think the text very clearly presents it as 2 separate things. So one quality is those foremost of those who are able to teach and transform people, inducing them to make gifts to the sangha. And the other one is preparing beds and seats. And I think it makes a lot of sense to keep that separate because we know the early sangha was a wandering sangha. So many people came and went in and out of monasteries all the time. And we have obligations in the Vinaya how to look after visitors and how to look after newcomers. So preparing stuff for them and looking after them and making sure they have everything and know everything that they need to know. And we have similar qualities in the Pali for the monks. So it kind of does make sense that a nun would be assigned a similar quality for nuns communities. So I think that Suyama is actually some kind of guest nun. And it does make sense to keep those 2 qualities separate, in my opinion. Anyway, I thought it was very beautiful to see that there was a guest nun, because that is something that we still have nowadays in our communities. And I feel there's some kind of connection and some kind of continuity there. Of those who have a mind that is always calm and does not generate agitated perceptions is the nun called Indaja. So she has a samadhi practice. Of those who never tire of contemplating the Dharma with understanding is the nun called Nagi. So she has a vipassana practice. Of those who have a strong and courageous mind and are not polluted by attachments is the nun called Kunala. So I love that quality very much, because it's usually, I mean, being strong and courageous are usually qualities that are kind of ascribed to men rather than to women. So seeing that the diversity of practice in the nun sangha, and seeing that these kind of these kind of qualities were also ascribed to nuns, is what I thought was very inspiring. Of those who enter concentration on water, turning everything into moisture, is the nun called Vasu. And of those who enter concentration on fire, fully illuminating anything, is the nun called Chandi. So here again, we see 4 element practices. Just now we saw earth, now we see water and fire. And of those who contemplate impurity and analyze dependent arising is the nun called Chapa. So this is again a vipassana quality. Impurity is asubha, and of course dependent origination, I think, is clear. And Chapa is so fascinating. I was so happy to see her on this list when I read the list for the first time, because Chapa has verses in the Therīgāthā. And in the Therīgāthā, she's a very different person. She's not a nun. She's not even Buddhist. She is just a married woman, and her husband wants to go forth as a monk, and she does everything she can to obstruct him from going forth. And she even threatens to kill their only son to make him stay, but it doesn't work, and he goes forth anyway, and he becomes fully enlightened. And that's where the Therīgāthā verse ends. And so we don't know what happens to Chapa. Only in the commentary we hear that later she also went forth and got fully enlightened. And then we encounter her again here in this Chinese text, and we see that she did actually go forth, and she even became a foremost nun. So a complete turnaround of her character, from being very hostile towards Buddhism to being one of the foremost nuns. And I thought that was, again, a puzzle piece coming together and just completing a story that we cannot completely see if we only look at one tradition of Buddhism. So, and the foremost of those who support people, giving them what is lacking, is the nun called Sukha. And Sukha is found in the Pali tradition, and she has verses in the Therīgāthā, and she's also mentioned in 2 discourses in the Aṅguttara Nikāya. And she is highly, highly praised for her teaching abilities. But again, she reappears in different traditions. She also reappears in various apadāna stories. So it seems that she was very popular in later tradition. People were very interested in her apadānas, in her life stories. And she is a nun that is, again, her character is, again, kind of different in the different traditions. So in the Pali, she's a highly revered teacher. And here in this particular Chinese text, she seems to be doing socially engaged Buddhist practice or charity work or something. So unless giving people what is lacking refers to Dhamma teachings, it seems to be a fairly different personality that is described here compared to the Pali. And the last one, among my ordained disciples who attain final realization, the foremost of those nuns is the nun called Bhattakundalakesa. So she has the same quality as in Pali. And just want to mention, if somebody looks at the original Chinese text, you will see that the text is actually corrupted. Her quality is missing. So the original text only says that she is the last of the foremost nuns, but doesn't mention her quality. So Bhante Analayo has restored that from a discourse quotation. So this list is quoted in another discourse where her quality is mentioned. So that's how Bhante Analayo inserted it here. And if you look at the original, now you know why there is this discrepancy. And I know I'm going over time, so I'm going to be more quick, but I do want to go through this last one as well. This is the individual discourse. And this one is really interesting because this list is not an early Buddhist text. It seems to be slightly later than the other two lists, and it does have some unique features. So I really want to go through it quickly, as quickly as possible. So among my bhikkhunīs, the great bhikkhuni disciple who has left behind a royal family, has long gone forth with pure conduct and always keeping celibacy, is Mahapajapati Gautami, Mahapajapati Bhikkhuni. So we see Mahapajapati again as the first nun mentioned, and we can immediately see that this list is later because it is mentioned that she went forth from a royal family. And the idea that the Buddha's family was royal stems from a later historical period. In the early Buddhist texts, the Buddha was not a prince. Suddhodana, his father, was not a king. Mahapajapati was not a queen. The Sakyans were not a kingdom. Sakyans were a republic. They were governed by a council of the male heads of the families. So the idea that Suddhodana was the king, and that is a later idea. And so because here it is said she went forth from a royal family, that immediately tells us that this list is somewhat later. So now we expect Khema and Upalavanna, but no. The next one is Patachara. And here she is described as one who is of few wishes, who knows moderation, and who follows the ascetic practices. So this is unexpected. Patachara is usually associated with the Vinaya. We have seen that in the other two lists. So here Patachara seems to have swapped places with Kisa Gautami, who is usually the one doing ascetic practices. And now we see Khema and Upalavanna with their usual qualities of wisdom and unsurpassed psychic powers. Now, the one who undertakes what should be practiced and easily attains the divine eye is Soma. We would have expected Sakula here. In the Chinese and in the Pali, Sakula is the one with the divine eye. But we see Soma, and as I mentioned, Soma is very, very different in the different traditions. We are going to see her again, so I'm not going to recap. I'm going to recap later. The one who contemplates what she has heard and has accumulated vast knowledge is Supa Kamaradita Bhikkhuni. So we haven't seen Supa Kamaradita so far, but she appears in the Pali as well as in various Chinese Vinayas. She has a very long verse in the Therīgāthā. She is Suba, the goldsmith's daughter. And yeah, she also reappears in the Vinaya, where she is Upalavanna's student. And yeah, it seems that she was quite popular in various Buddhist traditions. The one who is able to keep the Vinaya rules without fail is Kisa Gautami Bhikkhuni. So as I mentioned, she has swapped places with Patachara, and is here in this list. She is the one who is keeping Vinaya. The one who is skilled at proclaiming the marvelous Dhamma is Dhammadina Bhikkhuni. So Dhammadina always has the same quality. And I think that's also partially to do with her name, because when you're called Dhammadina, then there's the immediate association with teaching Dhamma. So that's why I think all the traditions have preserved her quality in the same way. And of those who always propagate the marvelous Dhamma out of compassion is the Bhikkhuni Dhamma, the Sakyan daughter. So there is a Dhamma in the Therīgāthā also, might be the same person. And of those who intensively engage in noble deeds and is a light among the families is Mahasukha Bhikkhuni. So here we see Sukha again. And as I mentioned, in the Pali tradition, she is a great teacher. In the Chinese discourse the Chinese list we have seen just now, she was the one who gives families what is lacking. So she seemed to do some kind of socially engaged Buddhism. And here her quality is very similar because she intensively engages in noble deeds and is a light among families. So it also seems that she is doing merit-making activities or maybe helping families and so on. So that is Sukha. And the one who, seeking great fruit, went forth out of faith is the bhikkhuni, mother of Sigalaka, the householder. So Sigalaka Mata, we have seen her in the Pali with exactly the same quality. And those who did good deeds in previous lives and are now endowed with great merit, the foremost is Rahula Mata Yasodhara Bhikkhuni. So finally, we see Yasodhara somewhere. And as I mentioned, Yasodhara doesn't appear in any of the early texts. So this is, again, an indication that this list is a later list. And we also see, as I mentioned, Yasodhara's character isn't well defined. In the Pali, Kachana has a quality that is linked to wisdom. In the first Chinese list, she has a quality that is linked to faith. And now she has a quality of merit making. So yeah, it just seems very different. And then of those who practice persistently and have great energy, the foremost is Jatila Bhikkhuni. Jatila we haven't seen so far, but she does appear in the Pali one single time in a tiny paragraph where she and Ananda meet when they're both alone in the forest, and they discuss a very profound meditation attainment. And Jatila also appears in a origin story in the Sarvastivada Bhikkhuni Vinaya, where she is highly learned and she asks a profound Abhidhamma question of a monk, and the monk can't answer and he's very embarrassed. And then the Buddha lays down a rule that nuns are not allowed to ask monks questions unless the monks have previously allowed it, to prevent monks from being embarrassed by the more highly learned bhikkhunis. So Jatila does appear elsewhere. She's always highly praised. And here she has a quality of being persistent and having great energy, which is not something that we see in other traditions. But yeah, it's interesting. She is such a marginal figure that her character probably wasn't well defined in the early traditions. So one of those who can swiftly attain her goal is Bada Kundalakesa Bhikkhuni. She has the same quality in all traditions. And of those who have profound wisdom and understand the suttas and the Vinaya well, the foremost is Miaojing Bhikkhuni. So she's again one where we cannot reconstruct the Indic name. So these are the lists. I know I've gone over time. I hope you enjoyed them. And as promised, there's also the Apadāna literature, and I'll make it very, very brief. There are 4 nuns mentioned in the Apadāna Sataka, which is a Sanskrit text, somewhat later text. And Apadāna Sataka means 100 texts, 100 Apadāna texts. And of those 100 stories, there are 10 stories about nuns. And of those 10 stories, 4 of them assign foremost qualities to nuns. So story number 72 assigns foremost among those making merit to Suppiya Bhikkhuni. And Suppiya does appear in the Pali, and she does make a lot of merit, but she is a lay woman. So maybe there is a connection here, who knows? But it is very similar to the person described in the Pali. Story 74 is again Soma. And this is the 4th time we see Soma, and the 4th time that she is described very differently. So in the Pali, she was the one who challenged Mara's ideas of gender. In the first Chinese list, she was the one who was foremost in compassion. In the second Chinese list, she was the one who had the divine eye. And now here she is foremost among those who have heard much and among those who remember what they have heard. So clearly her character varies widely in the different traditions. Then we have Kajangala. Kajangala is very interesting because she is one of the very, very few nuns who have a discourse, an entire discourse preserved in the Pali tradition, and where the Buddha praises her very much and says if he had given the discourse, he would have given it exactly in the same way as Kajangala Bhikkhuni. So she does exist in the Pali. And here in this apadāna, she has a very interesting story. She was the Buddha's mother in 500 past lives, and she was supposed to be his mother also in the last life, when he becomes a Buddha instead of Maya. But then she committed some kind of misdeed and lost the merit, and then Maya was instead the one who gave birth to the Buddha in the last life. And similar to the Pali, similar to the Pali discourse, she is very good at explaining suttas. So her character, this quality aligns very well with the Pali tradition as well. And then, of course, Khema, again, foremost among those with great wisdom, among those with great eloquence. So that is very similar across all traditions. And then there's another text, the Karma Sataka, which is also an apadāna text, only preserved in Tibetan. Originally translated, obviously, from an Indic language, but the Indic original has not survived. And I cannot read Tibetan, but very fortunately, there is a French translation, 120 years old. And if you search a lot, you can find it on the internet. And in that Karma Sataka, there are many stories of nuns, but only one nun is assigned a foremost quality, and that is in the story number 20. There is Kesavati. This is a nun we haven't seen so far. She was the hairdresser of Maya. And when Mahapajapati went forth together with her 500 women, she was one of those women. And she was foremost among those who undertake heroism. So that's a very interesting quality, one we haven't seen so far. Again, one that is kind of male gendered. But yeah, here it is assigned to this hairdresser. And yeah, I was just very happy to discover this one last nun in this Karma Sataka text. And I just wanted to share that with you. And this is the end of the foremost nuns that I wanted to share with you. I'm not going to go into the Khmer list now. If you want to see the Khmer list, you can ask a question, but I've already gone a lot over time. So yeah, I want to leave time for questions now. And yeah, if you want to see the Khmer list, please ask, and otherwise ask all the other questions that you have. Just going to check if anybody has left a question in the live chat, but I don't see any question. Does anybody have a question?
Venerable, hi, sorry. Yeah, just a very quick question. Could you repeat the numbering of the Chinese Āgama, where we could find the text?
Yes.
That you just...
So that individual discourse that is not found in a collection is T126. And the other list, the long list with the 50 nuns, was in the Ekottara Āgama, and that is 5.1 to 5.5.
Thank you.
Yeah, Esther?
Could you tell us where to find the encounter of the Venerable Chatila and Ananda in the Pali canon? Where is this?
Yes, I can tell you, but I have to look it up. Let's see if I have that here. Yes, that is Aṅguttara Nikāya 9.37. And you have to look through the entire sutta because the sutta is a little bit long. I think it's there is, like, if you have Bhikkhu Bodhi's version, there is a number 9 there somewhere in the text, and is this like ninth paragraph or whatever that 9 stands for, and it should be there or somewhere around there.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. This is the first time I've heard that that Sakya was a republic. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. So in the Buddha's time, what we see in the early discourses is that there were, like in the central Ganges plain where the Buddha was teaching, there were very small countries. Usually they're called the 16 Mahajanapada, or the 16 great countries. But by modern standards, we wouldn't really call them great countries. They're fairly small countries. And some of them were kingdoms. So for example, the kingdom of Kosala and the kingdom of Magadha. And some of them were republics. For example, the Vajji Republic and also the Sakyan Republic. So it's quite well attested. Like there are discourses where the Buddha goes returns to the Sakyan country, and where they describe how they built a new assembly hall, where they always assemble and where they carry out their business. It is fairly clear that there was no king in Sakya from the circumstances how the discourses are portrayed and the environment that we see. It is fairly clear that Sakya was a republic at the time, such as other. I mean, it wasn't the only republic. There were other smaller countries, such as the Vajjans, who were also republics at that time. So that wasn't an unusual government model at the time. But in the years after the Buddha's passing, the years and decades after the passing, the bigger kingdoms slowly took over all the smaller republics until this entire area was united under the Magadhan kingdom a few decades or maybe a century after the Buddha, or maybe 1 or 2 centuries after the Buddha's passing.
Thank you.
I see Dana has left a question in the chat. I feel puzzled about the rule for nuns in one of the Patimokkha's not to ask monks questions. Is that among the Theravada rules for nuns as well? Yes, that rule is found in almost all of the, I don't know if I should say all or almost all. I know it's found in many. I could look it up and see if it's in all, but let's just say it's in most of the Patimokkha's of most of the schools. And usually the origin stories always say that the nuns were highly learned and that the monks were embarrassed. So yeah. As I mentioned last time, the origin stories are from a significantly later time. They don't go back to the Buddha. So at that time, as I mentioned last time, gender relations weren't equal anymore. So being challenged by a woman would have been very difficult for the man at that time. And probably that is why the origin stories were written in the way they were written. And I mean, even nowadays, I know so many nuns who had encounters with monks, and the monks then were embarrassed and just pointed out the rule to them and said, well, you shouldn't have asked me in the first place. So that's still very common until nowadays. Okay, so I think if there are no further questions, we can finish up for today. Next time, we're going to talk about Mahapajapati. So I hope you're all looking forward to that. And we will finish, as usual, with 3 sadhus. So if you want, you can join me. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And see you all next time.